Tom's hands shook as he stared at the bright yellow paper stuck to his apartment door. The words, "Final Eviction Notice," seemed to jump out at him in bold red letters. Behind him, his 12-year-old son Danny stood quietly, his backpack still hanging from his shoulders after another day at school. "Dad, what's that paper about?" Danny asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Tom swallowed hard and tried to keep his voice steady. "Just some paperwork, buddy. Let's go inside." But they both knew it wasn't just paperwork. For the past 6 months, ever since the car factory shut down and laid off 300 workers, Tom had been fighting a losing battle. The unemployment checks barely covered groceries, let alone the $800 rent that was due every month. Walking into their small 2-bedroom apartment, Tom looked around at what little they had left. The TV was gone, sold 3 months ago. The couch had been replaced with 2 folding chairs from a garage sale. Even Danny's gaming console had been traded for cash to buy school supplies and winter clothes. Danny dropped his backpack by the door and went straight to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator and Tom's heart sank. A half-empty jar of peanut butter, some bread that was getting stale, and a few apples that were starting to turn brown. That was dinner, and probably breakfast too. "I'm not really hungry anyway," Danny said, closing the fridge door. He was lying, and they both knew it. The kid had been saying that a lot lately, trying to make things easier for his dad. Tom sat down at the small kitchen table and pulled out his wallet. 3 $20 bills and some loose change. $47 to his name. The eviction notice gave them 3 days to pay the $2,000 they owed in back rent, or they'd be out on the street. He thought about calling his sister in California, but she'd already helped twice before and made it clear she couldn't afford to keep bailing them out. His parents had passed away years ago, and most of his friends from the factory were struggling just as much as he was. Danny sat down across from him and started pulling homework from his backpack. Math worksheets, a book report, a science project, about weather patterns. Tom watched his son work and felt a familiar pain in his chest. This kid deserved so much better than what life had thrown at them. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Danny asked without looking up from his homework. Tom wanted to lie, to tell him everything would work out fine. Instead, he reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "We're going to figure something out, I promise." That night, after Danny had gone to bed, Tom sat at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and the local newspaper spread out in front of him. He'd been through the want ads 3 times already, circling anything that might work. Warehouse jobs, night shift cleaning, even telemarketing positions that probably didn't pay enough to matter. He was about to fold up the paper when something caught his eye in the classified section. It was a tiny ad, just 2 lines long, tucked between advertisements for used lawnmowers and garage sales. Mountain cabin for sale, $1, cash only, as is condition. Serious inquiries only. Tom read it again, then a 3rd time. $1? It had to be some kind of mistake or maybe a scam. Nobody sold property for $1 unless something was seriously wrong with it. He looked at the phone number listed and wondered if it was worth calling. The next morning, while Danny was getting ready for school, Tom dialed the number. A woman answered with a voice that sounded tired and old. "Hello, I'm calling about the cabin ad in the paper," Tom said. "The one for $1? "Oh, yes," the woman replied. "You're the first person to call who didn't think it was a joke. My name is Ruth Hendricks. The cabin belonged to my uncle, but he passed away 15 years ago. It's been sitting empty ever since. Can I ask why you're only asking for $1? Ruth sighed. "Honey, the place is falling apart. The county's been after me to either fix it up or tear it down, and I can't afford to do either. I'd rather see someone try to make something of it than watch it get bulldozed for unpaid taxes." Tom felt his heart start to beat faster. "Where is it located?" "About 3 hours south of the city, up in the hills of West Virginia. It's pretty remote. Nearest neighbor is about 2 miles away." Like I said, it needs a lot of work. The roof leaks. There's no heat, except for an old wood stove, and I can't promise the plumbing even works anymore. 3 hours away meant Danny would have to change schools. But what choice did they have? The alternative was sleeping in their car come Saturday. "Could I come take a look at it today?" Tom asked. "If you want to waste the gas money, sure. But I'm telling you now, most folks take one look and drive right back where they came from." After Danny left for school, Tom emptied his gas tank fund, $12 that was supposed to last the rest of the week, and filled up his beat-up Honda. The drive to West Virginia took them through small towns and winding mountain roads that seemed to get narrower with every mile. When he pulled up to pick Danny up from school, his son could tell something was different. "We're going for a ride," Tom said. "I want to show you something." "What kind of something?" "Maybe a new place to live." Danny's eyes widened. "Are we moving?" "We might have to, buddy, but I want you to see it first, okay? We'll decide together, the say." Drive gave Tom time to think about how to explain their situation without scaring Danny too much. His son was smart, probably too smart, and had already figured out that things weren't going well. But there was a difference between knowing they were struggling and knowing they were about to be homeless. "Dad, is this because of the paper on our door?" Danny asked about an hour into the drive. Tom looked at his son in the rearview mirror. Those brown eyes that looked so much like his mother's were watching him carefully. "Yeah, it is. We owe some money that I don't have right now, so we need to find somewhere else to live for a while." "How long is a while?" "I don't know yet, but I promise you, we're going to be okay. It might be different than what we're used to, but we'll make it work." The GPS led them down a gravel road that seemed to go on forever. Trees pressed in on both sides, and Tom started to worry they'd taken a wrong turn. Finally, they came to a small clearing with a mailbox that said Hendricks in faded letters. The cabin sat about 50 yards back from the road, and Tom's heart sank the moment he saw it. Ruth hadn't been exaggerating. The place looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. The roof sagged in the middle, several windows were boarded up with plywood, and what was left of the front porch was barely hanging on to the rest of the structure. "Is that it?" Danny asked, his voice small. "Yeah, that's it." They sat in the car for a moment, both staring at what might become their new home. Tom felt like the worst father in the world. How could he even consider bringing his son to live in a place like this? An old pickup truck pulled up behind them, and a woman in her 70s climbed out slowly. She was small and thin, with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that had seen better days. "You must be Tom," she said, walking over to their car. "I'm Ruth." Tom and Danny got out to meet her. Ruth looked at Danny with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "You've got a handsome boy there," she said. "How old are you, son?" 12, Danny replied politely. "That's a good age. Old enough to be helpful, young enough to still believe in possibilities." Ruth walked toward the cabin, and Tom and Danny followed. Up close, the damage was even worse than it had looked from the road. The front steps were rotted through, and they had to walk carefully to avoid falling through. "I know it doesn't look like much," Ruth said, pulling out an old key. "But the bones of the house are solid. My uncle built it himself back in 1962, and he knew what he was doing." Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. Dust particles danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to filter through the boarded windows. The main room had a stone fireplace, with an old wood stove sitting in front of it. A small kitchen occupied one corner, and Tom could see 2 bedroom doors leading off the main area. "The well still produces good water," Ruth said, turning on a faucet. After a few seconds of sputtering, clear water began to flow. "And the electric company still has it connected, though you'd need to call them to turn it back on." Danny walked around the room, touching the walls and looking up at the exposed ceiling beams. "It's bigger than our apartment," he said quietly. Ruth smiled. Your Uncle Harold loved this place, lived here for 40 years without ever wanting to be anywhere else. He was what you might call a loner, but he was happy here. What happened to him? Danny asked. Heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful way to go, if you ask me. He was 78 years old and had lived exactly the life he wanted. Tom looked around the room and tried to imagine fixing it up. The work would be enormous, and he didn't have money for materials or tools. But the alternative was living in their car, or hoping the homeless shelter had space for them. How much land comes with it? He asked. 23 acres, mostly wooded. There's a creek that runs along the back border and plenty of room for a garden if you're inclined that way. 23 acres. Tom had grown up in apartments and had never owned more than a houseplant, but the idea of that much space felt like freedom. I have to ask, he said. Why only $1? There has to be a catch. Ruth looked out the window toward the trees. Harold was my father's youngest brother, a good man, but different from the rest of the family. He never married, never had kids. When he died, he left everything to me. But I was already in my 60s and living in Florida. I couldn't move up here to take care of the place. She turned, back to Tom and Danny. I've been paying taxes on it for 15 years, watching it fall apart from a distance. The county's been patient, but they want it fixed up or torn down. I'm too old and too poor to do either one. So you'd rather see someone try to save it than watch it get destroyed? Exactly. And looking at you two, I think maybe you need this place as much as it needs you. Tom felt Danny's hand slip into his. His son was looking up at him with hope in his eyes for the first time in months. What do you think, buddy? Tom asked. Danny looked around the room again, then up at the high ceiling with its strong wooden beams. I think Uncle Harold wouldn't mind if we tried to fix it up. Tom pulled out his wallet and handed Ruth a crumpled dollar bill. She smiled and shook his hand. Welcome home, she said. The drive back to town felt different than the trip up to the cabin. Danny pressed his face against the car window, watching the mountains roll by as the sun started to set behind the trees. Tom gripped the steering wheel and tried to push down. The panic that was rising in his chest. What had he just done? He'd spent their last dollar on a cabin that looked ready to collapse. No heat, except for a wood stove he didn't know how to use. No guarantee the electricity could even be turned back on. And winter was coming fast. Dad, are you okay? Danny asked from the back seat. Tom looked in the rearview mirror and saw his son watching him with worried eyes. Just thinking through. Some things, buddy. Good things or bad things? Honest answer. A little bit of both. When they got back to their apartment, Tom sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started making lists. Things they'd need to make the cabin livable. Things they'd need to move. Things they couldn't afford, but would have to figure out anyway. The biggest problem was heat. October was already getting cold, and the mountains would be even colder. He'd never used a wood stove in his life, and buying firewood would cost money they didn't have. But maybe he could learn to cut wood himself. The property had 23 acres of trees, after all. Danny came and sat across from him, homework spread out on the table. Can I help make the list? Tom handed him the pen. What do you think we need most? Danny chewed on the end of the pen, for a moment. Blankets. Lots of blankets. And maybe some way to cook food that doesn't need electricity, in case the power doesn't work. Smart kid. Tom added those items to the list. They spent the next hour going through everything they owned, deciding what to keep and what to sell. The reality was harsh. They could fit everything important in the back of Tom's Honda, with maybe a small trailer if they could borrow one. The next morning brought another problem. Tom called the electric company about getting power turned on. At the cabin, and the woman on the phone delivered bad news. There's a deposit required for reconnection after extended disconnection, she said in a bored voice. That'll be $250 plus a $50 reconnection fee. $300. Tom thanked her and hung up. He had $46 left after buying gas for the trip to the cabin. 300 might as well have been 3,000. But then he remembered something Ruth had mentioned. She'd been paying taxes on the property for 15 years. That meant there might be some kind of payment plan or assistance available. He spent the morning making phone calls. The county office, the electric company's customer service department, even calling Ruth to ask about any programs she knew about. Most of the calls led nowhere, but finally he reached a woman at the Rural Assistance Office who had some hope to offer. "There's a winter assistance program for low-income families," she explained. "It can help with utility deposits and connections, but you'd need to apply and provide documentation of your income and situation." "How long does that take?" "Usually about 2 weeks if you have all the right paperwork." 2 weeks. They had 3 days before eviction. Tom thanked her and added the information to his notes. But his heart was sinking again. Danny got home from school that afternoon to find his dad packing boxes in the living room. Most of what they owned was already sorted into 3 piles: keep, sell, and throw away. The keep pile was depressingly small. "We're really doing this?" Danny asked, dropping his backpack by the door. "We don't have much choice, buddy, but I called your school today and talked to the principal. The school up near the cabin is small, but they've got good programs, and the principal said she'd help make sure the transition goes smoothly." Danny sat down on one of the boxes and looked around their apartment. It wasn't much, but it had been home for 3 years. "Will I be able to visit my friends?" That question hit Tom harder than he'd expected. 3 hours was a long way for a 12-year-old, especially when gas money was tight. "We'll figure out a way to make that happen, maybe during school breaks or summer vacation." "What about your job search? Won't it be harder to find work up there?" Another smart question from a kid who was thinking like an adult way too early. "There's a town about 20 minutes from the cabin. Not much industry, but maybe I can find something. And if not, I might need to commute to the city for work at least until we get settled." That night, Tom lay awake staring at the ceiling and doing math in his head. Gas money for a daily commute to the city would eat up most of whatever he could earn, but staying local might mean taking jobs that paid even less than unemployment benefits. Either way, it was going to be tight. The next day brought their first piece of luck in months. Tom's neighbor, an older man named Pete who worked maintenance for the apartment complex, knocked on their door around noon. "Heard you folks might be moving," Pete said. "Was wondering if you might want to sell some furniture before you go." Tom showed him around the apartment, pointing out the few pieces they couldn't take with them. A kitchen table that was too big for the cabin, a dresser that wouldn't fit in the car, some kitchen appliances they wouldn't need. Pete looked everything over and made an offer. "I can give you $120 for the lot, and I'll haul it away myself." It wasn't much, but it was something. Tom shook his hand, and by that afternoon their apartment looked even emptier than before. Danny spent his last day at school saying goodbye to friends and teachers. When he came home, his eyes were red like he'd been crying, but he tried to put on a brave face. "My teacher said she'll help me stay in touch with everyone," he said, pulling papers from his backpack. "And she gave me some extra books to take with us in case the library up there isn't very big." Tom looked at the stack of books his son's teacher had gathered. Math workbooks, science readers, even some fiction novels that looked way above Danny's grade level. There was a note attached. "Danny is a bright boy with a lot of potential. Please don't let this transition set him back academically. Call me if you need any help with school records or recommendations." That evening, their landlord stopped by to check on their packing progress. Tom expected another lecture about the money they owed, but instead the man surprised him. "Pete told me you're moving to West Virginia," he said. "That's a big change. You sure about this?" "Not really," Tom admitted, "but we're out of other options." The landlord nodded and looked around the mostly empty apartment. "I've got to ask for the keys tomorrow, you understand. But I'm not going to report the debt to collections right away. Give you some time to get settled, maybe find work. If you can start making payments in a few months, we can work something out." It was more kindness than Tom had expected. He thanked the man and promised to stay in touch. Their last night in the apartment, Tom and Danny sat on the floor eating pizza that Tom had splurged on with some of Pete's furniture money. They'd packed everything they were keeping into boxes that now sat stacked by the front door. "Are you scared?" Danny asked, picking pepperoni off his slice. Tom thought about lying, about telling his son that everything would be fine. Instead, he decided on honesty. "Yeah, I'm scared. This is the biggest gamble I've ever made. But you know what? Sometimes when you don't have any safe choices left, the scary choice becomes the brave choice. What if the cabin is too broken to fix? Then we'll figure out something else. We're not quitters, you and me." Danny nodded and took another bite of pizza. "I looked up the school online today. They have a science club that builds rockets." "Rockets?" "Model rockets. The kind that actually fly. My teacher said I should ask about joining when we get there." Tom smiled. It was the first time in weeks that Danny had talked about something he was excited for instead of something he was leaving behind. The next morning, they loaded the Honda with everything they owned: clothes, books, a few family photos, some basic tools Tom had kept from his factory days. It all fit, barely, with the back seat folded down and boxes crammed into every available space. Before they left, Tom walked through the empty apartment one more time. 3 years of their lives in these rooms. Danny learning to ride a bike in the parking lot outside. Christmas mornings by the living room window. Homework sessions at the kitchen table that was now in Pete's apartment. But it was also the place where he'd gotten the phone call about the factory closing, where he'd sat night after night applying for jobs that never called back, where he'd had to explain to Danny why they couldn't afford new school clothes or birthday parties with friends. Maybe it was time for a fresh start, even if that start was more terrifying than anything he'd ever done. Danny was waiting by the car, a small backpack slung over his shoulder. "Ready?" Tom locked the apartment door for the last time and dropped the keys through the landlord's mail slot. "Ready?" The drive back to the mountains felt longer this time, weighted down with the reality of what they were doing. Every mile took them further from everything familiar, deeper into an unknown that could either save them or leave them in an even worse situation than before. But as they wound through the hills and the cabin came into view, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the possibility of hope, which was more than he'd had yesterday. Danny rolled down his window and breathed in the mountain air. "It smells different here. Good different or bad different? Just different. Like trees and fresh air and maybe some kind of flowers." Tom parked in the same spot where Ruth had met them 2 days ago. The cabin looked just as rough as it had before, but somehow it didn't seem quite as hopeless. Maybe because now it was theirs. "Well," Tom said, turning off the engine. "Here we are." "Here we are," Danny echoed. They sat for a moment looking at their new home. Then Danny opened his door and stepped out onto the gravel. "Come on, Dad. Uncle Harold's probably wondering what took us so long." Their first night in the cabin was the longest night of Tom's life. Without electricity, they used flashlights and candles to see their way around. The old wood stove sat cold and silent in the corner, and Tom stared at it like it was some kind of puzzle he couldn't solve. Danny curled up on the floor in his sleeping bag, using his backpack as a pillow. "Dad, it's really quiet here." "Too quiet?" "No, good quiet. Like the world went to sleep." But Tom couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the old cabin made him wonder if the roof was about to cave in. The wind through the trees sounded like whispers, and somewhere in the distance, an owl kept calling out into the darkness. When morning came, Tom felt like he'd been hit by a truck. But Danny was up with the sunrise, exploring their new home with the excitement only a 12-year-old could manage. "Dad, come look at this," Danny called from outside. Tom stumbled out to find his son standing by a pile of split firewood that had been covered with an old tarp. There had to be 2 full cords of wood there, dry and ready to burn. "Uncle Harold must have cut this before he died," Danny said, running his hands over the smooth wood. "That's good luck, right?" Good luck. Tom hadn't thought about luck in months, but maybe his son was right. He picked up a piece of the wood and examined it. Oak, from the look of it. Good burning wood that would put out serious heat. Now he just had to figure out how to use that wood stove. The first week was a crash course in mountain living. Tom drove to the local hardware store and bought a book about wood stoves with money from selling their furniture. The store owner, a weathered man named Bill, looked at Tom's soft city hands and shook his head. "First time running a wood stove?" Bill asked. "Is it that obvious?" "Son, you got city folk written all over you, but don't worry, it's not rocket science. Just got to respect the fire and understand how airflow works." Bill spent 20 minutes explaining dampers and draft controls, showing Tom how to build a proper fire that would burn hot and clean. He even threw in a box of fire starter cubes for free. "Bring your boy around sometime," Bill said as Tom was leaving. "My granddaughter is about his age. Goes to the school up here. Might be nice for him to know somebody before his first day." Danny's first day at Mountain View Elementary was harder than either of them had expected. The school was tiny compared to his old one, just 4 classrooms serving grades kindergarten through 8th. But the principal, Mrs. Johnson, was kind and patient, walking Danny through his schedule and introducing him to his new teacher. "We've got 15 kids in the middle grades," Mrs. Johnson explained to Tom. "So Danny will be in a mixed class with 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. It sounds chaotic, but the older kids often help the younger ones. Creates a nice family atmosphere." That afternoon, Danny came home on the school bus looking exhausted. Tom was on the roof, trying to nail down some loose shingles he'd found at a construction site dumpster. "How was it?" Tom called down. "Different," Danny replied. "Really different. Over. Dinner, canned soup heated on a camping stove." Danny told him about his day. The kids were friendly enough, but they all seemed to know each other like family. They talked about hunting and fishing and four-wheelers like those things were normal parts of life. They knew which berries were safe to eat and could identify bird calls. "One girl asked if I'd ever shot a deer," Danny said, stirring his soup. "When I said no, they all looked at me like I was from Mars. Give it time, buddy. You'll find your place." But Tom was worried too. These mountain kids had skills and knowledge that came from generations of living off the land. How was a city kid supposed to compete with that? The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Danny came home excited for the first time since they'd moved. "Dad, you know that science club I told you about? The one that builds rockets?" "Yeah." "Well, they needed help with the math for calculating trajectory and stuff. Turns out all that advanced math my old teacher was making me do actually means something here." Tom smiled. Danny had always been good with numbers, but his old school had made him feel weird about being ahead of his grade level. Here, apparently, being smart was an advantage. "And get this," Danny continued, "the teacher wants me to help design a computer program to track the rocket flights. None of the other kids know much about computers." Within 2 weeks, Danny had found his niche. The mountain kids taught him about the outdoors, and he helped them with technology and advanced math. It was a fair trade that seemed to work for everyone. Tom's job search wasn't going as well. The local town had a gas station, a hardware store, a small grocery, and not much else. The nearest real job opportunities were 40 minutes away in Millfield, a slightly larger town with a few factories and businesses. He finally found work at a lumber mill in Millfield, loading trucks and running equipment for $12 an hour. It wasn't much, but it was steady work, and the foreman seemed to appreciate that Tom showed up on time and didn't complain about the heavy lifting. The commute ate up gas money and 2 hours of his day, but slowly they started to get ahead. Tom bought proper tools and materials to fix the cabin. He learned to patch the roof, replace broken windows, and even got the old well pump working properly. The wood stove became his pride and joy. After a few smoky disasters that had them both coughing and opening windows, Tom figured out the right technique. Soon he could keep the cabin warm and cozy even when the mountain winds howled outside. Danny helped with everything. He learned to split kindling, stack firewood, and even helped Tom rewire some of the electrical outlets using skills they found in library books. Working together in the evenings and weekends became their new normal. The neighbors were curious, but respectful. Every few days, someone would stop by to check on them. Mrs. Chen from down the road brought them fresh eggs and homemade bread. The Reynolds family invited them to dinner and taught Tom how to preserve vegetables for winter. "You boys are doing good work on the old place," Mr. Reynolds said one evening as they sat on the cabin's newly repaired front porch. Harold would be pleased to see it coming back to life. "Did you know him well?" Tom asked. "Well enough. He was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but he was good people, always willing to lend a hand if someone needed help." Mr. Reynolds paused and looked at the cabin. "He spent a lot of time down in that basement of his, working on something, though nobody ever knew what." Tom made a mental note to check out the basement soon. So far, they'd been too busy with the main floor to explore much. The basement door was locked with an old padlock, and Tom had assumed it was just storage space. November brought the first real snowfall, and Tom felt a surge of pride as their little wood stove kept the cabin perfectly warm. They'd weathered their first mountain winter challenge. Danny's grades were excellent, and he'd made real friends at school. Tom's job was steady, and they'd even managed to save a little money. One evening, as they sat by the fire doing homework and reading, Danny looked up from his math book. "Dad, I think we did the right thing coming here." Tom looked around their cozy cabin. The walls were patched and painted. The windows were tight and clean. The floors were swept, and the furniture, what little they had, was arranged to make the most of their small space. It felt like home in a way their apartment never had. "Yeah, I think we did too." Outside, snow was falling steadily, covering their little mountain world in peaceful white. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, filling the room with warm light and the smell of burning oak. For the first time in over a year, Tom felt like they might actually be okay. More than okay, they might even be happy. But he had no idea that their real adventure was just beginning, waiting for them behind a locked door in the basement below their feet. February came with the worst storm Tom had ever seen. The wind howled through the mountains like a living thing, bending trees and rattling windows. Snow piled up against their cabin in huge drifts, and the power lines went down somewhere between their place and town. Tom wasn't worried about the electricity. They'd learned to live mostly without it anyway. The wood stove kept them warm. They had oil lamps for light and enough canned food to last a week if needed. What he didn't expect was the water problem. It started on the second day of the storm. Danny was in the kitchen making hot chocolate. On their camping stove, when he called out, "Dad, something's wrong with the floor," Tom came over to find water seeping up between the floorboards near the sink. Not much at first, just enough to make the wood look darker. But within an hour, there was a small puddle forming. "Where's that coming from?" Danny asked, kneeling down to get a closer look. Tom grabbed a flashlight and examined the wet area. The water seemed to be coming from below, somewhere under the kitchen floor. He'd always assumed the cabin was built on a simple foundation, but now he realized there had to be space underneath. "I think we've got a problem in the basement," Tom said. "The basement? I thought that was just a storage room." Tom had thought the same thing. The door was at the back of the cabin, hidden behind some old furniture they'd never bothered to move. He'd tried the handle once when they first moved in, found it locked, and figured it wasn't important enough to worry about. Now, with water damage threatening their kitchen floor, he didn't have a choice. They moved the old dresser and bookshelf that had been blocking the basement door. Behind them was a heavy wooden door with a large, old-fashioned padlock, the kind of lock that looked like it had been there for decades. Should we call someone? Danny asked. Like a plumber or something? Tom looked outside at the blizzard still, raging. The roads were completely blocked, and even if they could get through, they couldn't afford to pay for emergency repairs. I think we're on our own for this one, buddy. Tom went to his toolbox and pulled out a crowbar. The padlock was old but solid. It took him 20 minutes of careful prying before the metal finally gave way with a loud crack. The door creaked, open on rusty hinges, revealing wooden stairs that disappeared into darkness below. A musty smell drifted up from the basement. Not unpleasant, just old and closed up. Want me to go first? Danny asked, trying to peer into the shadows. No way. I'll check it out and make sure it's safe. Tom grabbed his largest flashlight and started down the stairs. Each step groaned under his weight, but the wood felt solid enough. As he reached the bottom and swept his light around the room, his jaw dropped. This wasn't a storage basement. It was something else entirely. The space was much larger than he'd expected, stretching almost the full length of the cabin above. But what shocked him wasn't the size. It was what filled the room. Easels stood everywhere, some holding canvases, others empty but splattered with dried paint. Tables lined the walls, covered with brushes, tubes of paint, and palette knives. In one corner sat a pottery wheel with clay sculptures in various stages of completion. And covering every available wall space were paintings, dozens and dozens of them. "Dad, what's down there?" Danny called from the top of the stairs. "You need to see this," Tom called back, his voice barely above a whisper. Danny practically flew down the stairs, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. When he reached the bottom and saw what Tom was looking at, he stopped dead in his tracks. Whoa, Uncle Harold was an artist? Tom walked slowly around the room, shining his light on the paintings. They weren't amateur weekend hobby paintings. These were serious works of art, abstract pieces with bold colors and complex compositions. Realistic landscapes that looked like photographs, portraits that seemed to stare back at them from the canvas. "More than an artist," Tom said. "Look at this stuff. This is professional-level work." Danny walked over to a table covered with brushes and paint tubes. Most of the paint was dried up and cracked, but some of the newer tubes still had color inside them. He must have been working down here right up until he died. That's when Tom noticed the journal. It was sitting on a small desk in the corner, next to a reading lamp and a comfortable-looking chair. The leather cover was worn smooth from handling, and when Tom opened it, he found page after page of Harold's neat handwriting. "Listen to this," Tom said, reading from the first entry. "March 15th, 1978. I've decided to make the move permanent. The city has nothing left for me now. Maybe up here in the mountains I can remember why I started painting. In the first place." Tom flipped through more pages, reading bits and pieces aloud. Harold wrote about his daily life, his thoughts on art, descriptions of the paintings he was working on. But he also wrote about his past, a past that sounded much more interesting than anyone in town had realized. "Dad, look at this," Danny said, pointing to a newspaper clipping that had been tucked between the journal pages. The clipping was yellowed with age, but the headline was still clear. "Promising Young Artist Takes New York by Storm." Below it was a photo of a much younger Harold standing next to one of his paintings in what looked like a fancy gallery. Tom read the article out loud. Harold had been considered one of the most promising abstract painters of his generation. His work had sold for thousands of dollars, and major collectors were buying his pieces. The article mentioned several upcoming shows and talked about him as an artist to watch. But if he was famous, why did he come here? Danny asked. Tom kept reading through the journal, looking for answers. He found them about halfway through the book, in an entry dated June 3rd, 1978. "I can't do it anymore," Harold had written. "The gallery openings, the critics, the pressure to create what sells instead of what speaks to my soul. Rebecca's death showed me what really matters, and it isn't fame or money. I'm going back to the mountains where I can paint for the right reasons. Rebecca must have been someone important to him, Tom said quietly. They spent the next hour exploring the basement, discovering treasures in every corner. Sketches filled dozens of notebooks. Sculptures sat on shelves, some finished, others abandoned halfway through. In one closet, they found canvases that had been carefully wrapped and stored, as if Harold had been saving them for something special. But the most amazing discovery was in the far corner of the room. A series of large paintings, each one more beautiful than the last, that seemed to tell the story of Harold's life in the mountains. Sunrise over the hills, snow falling on the creek behind the cabin, wildlife moving through the forest. These weren't just paintings. They were love letters to the place that had become his home. I bet he never showed these to anyone, Danny said, standing in front of a painting that showed their cabin in the middle of summer, surrounded by wildflowers. Probably not. Look at this. Tom had found another journal entry, this one from just a few months before Harold died. 40 years I've been painting up here, Harold wrote, and I've never been happier with my work. I don't care if no one ever sees these pieces. They weren't made for galleries or critics. They were made because I had to make them, because the beauty of this place demanded to be captured. Tom and Danny looked around the room with new understanding. This wasn't just an artist's studio. It was Harold's private world, the place where he'd spent 4 decades creating art purely for the love of it. Dad, Danny said slowly, do you think any of this stuff is worth money? It was a question Tom had been afraid to ask himself. Some of these paintings looked like they belonged in museums. If Harold really had been famous once, maybe his later work was valuable too. I don't know, Tom admitted. But even if it's not worth anything, it's still incredible. Look what Uncle Harold accomplished up here. All by himself, just creating beautiful things because he wanted to. They were so absorbed in exploring that they almost forgot about the water leak that had brought them down here in the first place. It wasn't until Danny noticed water dripping from one corner of the ceiling that they remembered their original problem. There, Tom said, pointing his flashlight up at a pipe that was obviously leaking. That's our culprit. The pipe was old, but simple to fix. Tom was able to tighten a loose joint with his wrench, and the leak stopped immediately. But as he worked, his mind was racing with questions about what they'd discovered. Who was Rebecca? How famous had Harold really been? And most importantly, what were they supposed to do with a basement full of art that might be worth a fortune? As they climbed back up the stairs, their flashlights casting dancing shadows on the walls, Tom felt like their quiet mountain life was about to get a lot more complicated. Dad, Danny said as they reached the kitchen, are we going to tell anyone about what's down there? Tom looked back at the basement door, thinking about all those beautiful paintings sitting in the darkness below. I don't know yet, buddy. I honestly don't know. But he had a feeling that decision was going to be made for them sooner than they thought. Tom couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those paintings in the basement. The colors, the skill, the way Harold had captured light and shadow like he was trapping pieces of the sky itself. By morning, he'd made a decision. We need to talk to someone who knows about art, he told Danny over breakfast. Like who? There's nobody around here who knows that stuff. Tom had been thinking about that too. Your art teacher at school, Mrs. Patterson. She went to college for art, right? Maybe she could at least tell us if we're crazy for thinking this stuff looks professional. Danny perked up. Mrs. Patterson was one of his favorite teachers, mainly because she was the only one at Mountain View Elementary who understood that he liked to think about complicated things. She ran the after-school art club and had even helped Danny with a painting project that was now hanging in the school hallway. She knows a lot about famous artists, Danny said. She's always telling us stories about painters from history. Maybe she'd know about Uncle Harold. That afternoon, Tom drove to the school and waited for Mrs. Patterson to finish her classes. She was a woman in her 50s with paint-stained fingers and the kind of energy that made everyone around her feel more creative. Danny's father, right? She said when Tom introduced himself. That boy of yours has a real eye for art, Very unusual for someone his age. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. We found something at our cabin, and I was hoping you might be able to tell us what we're looking at. Tom pulled out his phone and showed her the pictures he'd taken in the basement. He'd photographed about 20 of the paintings, trying to capture the detail and quality of Harold's work. Mrs. Patterson's expression changed as she looked through the photos. She stopped talking and leaned closer to the phone screen, zooming in on different parts of the paintings. "Where did you say you found these?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. "In the basement of our cabin. They belong to the previous owner, a man named Harold Hendricks." Mrs. Patterson looked up at Tom with wide eyes. "Harold Hendricks? Are you sure that was his name?" "That's what his niece told us." "Why? Do you recognize the name?" "I need to make a phone call," Mrs. Patterson said, handing Tom back his phone. "Can you bring some of these paintings to the school tomorrow? I have a friend who needs to see them." The urgency in her voice made Tom nervous. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong. But if these are what I think they are, this is much bigger than you realize." That evening, Tom and Danny carefully carried 3 of the smaller paintings up from the basement. They wrapped them in old blankets and loaded them into the Honda. Tom felt like he was smuggling stolen goods, even though he knew the paintings legally belonged to them. The next day, Mrs. Patterson met them in the school parking lot with another woman who looked like she'd driven straight from the city. She was dressed in a sharp business suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone used to being the smartest person in the room. "This is Dr. Williams," Mrs. Patterson said. "She's an art history professor from the university, and she specializes in American painters from the 1960s and 70s. Dr. Williams shook Tom's hand but barely seemed to notice him. Her attention was completely focused on the paintings they'd brought. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the blankets. Tom nodded, and Dr. Williams carefully unwrapped the first painting. It was one of Harold's mountain landscapes, showing the view from their cabin during what looked like an autumn sunset. Dr. Williams studied the painting for a long moment, then pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the brushwork up close. She looked at the back of the canvas, checking for signatures or dates. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. She unwrapped the second painting, an abstract piece with swirling blues and greens that seemed to move even when you stood still. Her reaction was even stronger. "This time. My God," she whispered. "This is definitely his work, but this style, this is 20 years beyond anything in his known catalog." "Whose work?" Tom asked, though he was starting to suspect the answer. Dr. Williams looked up at him with excitement shining in her eyes. Harold Hendricks was Harrison H. Kendricks, one of the most important abstract expressionist painters of the late 20th century. He disappeared from the New York art scene in 1978, and no one has seen any of his work since then. Tom felt like the ground had shifted under his feet. "Are you saying these paintings are famous?" "I'm saying these paintings are by a famous artist who the art world assumed had stopped painting 30 years ago. If what you're telling me is true, if there are more of these in your basement, then you've made one of the most significant art discoveries in decades." Danny, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, spoke up. "How much are they worth?" Dr. Williams carefully rewrapped the paintings before answering. "His early work, the pieces he made before he disappeared, sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars each. But these later works, there's no way to estimate their value because nothing like them has ever been sold." She paused and looked directly at Tom. "I need to see the rest of the collection, all of it. And I need to call some colleagues who specialize in authentication. This could change everything we know about Kendricks's artistic development." The drive back to the cabin felt surreal. Tom kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see a convoy of art experts following them. Instead, there was just Dr. Williams in her rental car, probably making phone calls to museums and galleries. At the cabin, Dr. Williams spent 3 hours in the basement. She photographed every painting, cataloged the sculptures, and read through pages of Harold's journal. Tom and Danny watched from the stairs as she worked, too nervous to interrupt. Finally, she climbed back up to the kitchen and sat down at their small table. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and she looked like someone who'd just seen a ghost. "In 40 years of studying art," she said slowly, "I've never seen anything like this. You have over 200 paintings down there, plus sculptures and sketches. The artistic evolution is incredible. You can see how his style developed and matured over 3 decades of isolation." She pulled out her phone and showed them a website. "These are his early works. See the difference?" The paintings on the website were beautiful, but they looked almost simple compared to what they'd found in the basement. Harold's later work was more complex, more emotional, like he'd been learning new ways to express feelings that didn't have words. "What happens now?" Tom asked. "Now we need to authenticate everything properly. That means bringing in more experts, doing chemical analysis of the paints, verifying the signatures. The process could take months." "And then?" Dr. Williams smiled. "Then you'll probably be very wealthy. A conservative estimate for the entire collection would be in the range of $50 to $60 million. Tom's head started spinning. $60 million. It was more money than he'd ever imagined in his entire life. Enough to send Danny to any college he wanted. Enough to never worry about money again. But then he thought about Harold. Spending 40 years alone in that basement, creating beauty for no one but himself. Did they have the right to sell his life's work to the highest bidder? "There's something else," Dr. Williams continued. "Major museums are going to want these pieces. The Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney, the Smithsonian. This collection tells the story of one of America's great artists during the most productive period of his career." Danny looked at his father. "What do you think Uncle Harold would want us to do?" It was the same question Tom had been asking himself. Harold had chosen to live in isolation, away from the art world's attention and pressure. Would he want his private work displayed in museums, or would he prefer it to remain hidden? "I don't know," Tom admitted. "But I think we need to be really careful about this. These paintings weren't meant for anyone but Harold. Maybe we should think about what would honor his memory, not just what would make us the most money." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "That's very thoughtful, and there are options beyond just selling everything. You could donate pieces to museums, establish a foundation, or even turn the cabin into a museum itself." As the sun set over the mountains, Tom realized their quiet life was about to change forever. Whatever they decided to do with Harold's art, nothing would ever be the same again. But for the first time since they'd moved to the mountains, he wasn't worried about the future. Harold had left them more than just paintings. He'd left them choices and the freedom to make those choices carefully. The authentication process took 4 months, and they were the strangest 4 months of Tom's life. Art experts came and went from their little mountain cabin like it was some kind of pilgrimage site. They brought special cameras, chemical testing, equipment, and magnifying glasses that looked like they belonged in a science lab. Danny loved every minute of it. He followed the experts around, asking questions about paint analysis and canvas dating. One specialist from the Smithsonian spent an entire afternoon teaching him how to identify different painting techniques just by looking at brushstrokes. "Your son has a natural understanding of art," the woman told Tom. "Have you considered art lessons for him?" Tom laughed. "A year ago, I was worried about paying for groceries. Art lessons weren't exactly on my radar, but things were changing. Fast." News of the discovery had leaked to the art world, and suddenly Tom's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Gallery owners, museum directors, private collectors, and reporters all wanted to talk to the man who'd bought a $50 million art collection for $1. The final authentication report arrived on a Tuesday morning in June. Dr. Williams drove up from the university to deliver it personally. "It's official," she said, setting a thick folder on their kitchen table. "Every piece is authentic. The collection contains 247 paintings, 63 sculptures, and over 500 sketches and drawings. Conservative auction estimate is $52 million, but it could go higher depending on bidding. Tom stared at the number written on the official letterhead. $52 million. Even after 4 months of hearing experts talk about the collection's value, seeing it in writing felt unreal. "There's something else," Dr. Williams continued. "I've been contacted by 17 different museums who want to acquire pieces for their permanent collections. The Museum of Modern Art is offering $8 million for just 12 paintings." Danny looked up from his homework. $8 million for 12 paintings? That's like a lot of money per painting. "About $660,000 each," Tom said, doing the math automatically. Dr. Williams smiled. "You've both gotten much better at thinking in art market numbers." She was right. 4 months ago, Tom thought $100 was a lot of money. Now he was casually calculating million-dollar transactions. But the big numbers weren't what kept him awake at night. It was the decision of what to do with Harold's life work. The easy choice would be to sell everything and retire to a life of luxury. But every time Tom went down to the basement and looked at those paintings, he remembered what Harold had written in his journal. "They weren't made for galleries or critics. They were made because I had to make them." "Can I ask you something?" Tom said to Dr. Williams. "From what you know about Harold Harrison, what do you think he would have wanted us to do?" Dr. Williams was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the mountains Harold had painted so many times. "That's the question everyone in the art world is asking. Kendricks was famously private. He hated the commercial side of art, the pressure to produce work that would sell instead of work that mattered to him. So selling everything would go against what he believed in? Maybe. But keeping it all hidden would rob the world of some truly extraordinary art. It's a difficult balance." That evening, Tom and Danny sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. It was the kind of view Harold had captured in dozens of his paintings. "What are you thinking, Dad?" Tom had been asking himself the same question for weeks. "I keep thinking about why we ended up here in the first place. We were broke, desperate, and that $1 cabin was our only option. Harold's art saved our lives, but not because it was worth millions. It saved us because it gave us a home and a fresh start. So, you don't want to sell any of it?" I didn't say that. But maybe there's a way to honor Harold's memory while also doing some good with the money. Over the next week, Tom made a series of phone calls. He talked to museum directors, lawyers, tax advisors, and financial planners. Danny helped by researching foundations and charitable organizations online. Finally, they came up with a plan. They would sell 25 of Harold's paintings, enough to secure their financial future and provide for Danny's education through college. Tom quit his job at the lumber mill and used part of the money to start a small construction business, specializing in restoring old mountain cabins like theirs. The remaining artwork would become the foundation of the Harrison H. Kendricks Mountain Art Center. They would convert Harold's cabin into a small museum and artist retreat where young artists could come to create work in the same peaceful environment that had inspired Harold for 40 years. The profits from the art sales would fund scholarships for art students from rural communities, kids who had talent but not the money to pursue formal training. "It's like Harold's still teaching people," Danny said when they finalized the plans. "Just like he taught us that you don't need much money to make something beautiful." The first auction was held at Sotheby's in New York. Tom and Danny flew there to watch, staying in a hotel fancier than anywhere Tom had ever imagined. They sat in the back of the auction room, watching people bid hundreds of thousands of dollars for paintings that had been sitting quietly in their basement just months before. One of Harold's mountain landscapes sold for $1.2 million. An abstract piece went for $850,000. By the end of the evening, they'd raised over $15 million from just 12 paintings. "Dad," Danny whispered as they walked out of the auction house, We're actually rich now, aren't we? Yeah, buddy, we actually are. But the money wasn't the most important thing that changed in their lives. The real transformation was deeper than that. Danny's confidence had grown enormously. He was still the same smart, thoughtful kid he'd always been, but now he believed his ideas mattered. The art experts who'd visited their cabin had treated him like an equal, respecting his questions and insights. That kind of validation changes a 12-year-old forever. Tom had discovered something about himself, too. Managing the art authentication process, negotiating with museums, and setting up the foundation had revealed business skills he never knew he had. He was good at making complex decisions, at balancing different people's needs and interests. The Harrison H. Kendricks Mountain Arts Center opened 2 years later. The cabin had been carefully restored, with Harold's basement studio preserved exactly as they'd found it. Visitors could see where he'd worked and read excerpts from his journals displayed on the walls. The Artist Retreat program brought 12 young artists to the mountains each summer. They stayed in small cabins Tom's construction company built on the property, spending their days painting and sculpting in the same landscape that had inspired Harold. Danny, now 14, had become something of an unofficial tour guide for the center. He could tell Harold's story better than anyone, and he loved showing visitors the paintings that had hung hidden in their basement for 15 years. The coolest part, he would tell school groups, is that Uncle Harold never painted these to be famous or make money. He painted them because he loved this place and wanted to capture its beauty. That's what real art is about. On quiet evenings, Tom would sometimes walk down to Harold's old studio. They'd left it exactly as it was, with paintbrushes still sitting, in jars and unfinished canvases propped against the walls. "Thank you," he would say to the empty room, "for giving us a chance when we needed it most, and for showing us that the most valuable things in life aren't always the ones with the biggest price tags." Outside the windows, the mountains stretched away into the distance, unchanged and unchanging. The same view Harold had painted hundreds of times, the same beauty that would inspire artists for generations to come. From desperate poverty to unexpected wealth, from a $1 gamble to a $50 million discovery, their story had come full circle. But the most important part wasn't the money they'd gained, it was the home they'd found and the legacy they'd chosen to protect. Harold's art had taught them that true value comes from creating something meaningful, something that connects people to beauty and wonder. And in the end, that was the most valuable lesson of all.